I kind of realized out there during these search expeditions that the finding it almost doesn't matter. It's the fact that we're there and we're doing it. And we're in the middle of the North Atlantic, a place that it was much further and decades away from where we started, right? So it really makes you think that exploration is not always about the finding something, and I'm thrilled that we found it, but the real emotion of exploration is about being out there and looking for it.
Welcome to another episode of Fascinated by Shipwrecks, where we delve into the people and the science of maritime archaeology. I'm your host, Kathy A. Smith, and today I have Jennifer Sellitti with me. Has a really interesting background. She's not only a shipwreck hunter, she's a U.S. Coast Guard captain and also an attorney by day. So that's quite an interesting combination. So thank you so much for being here today, Jennifer.
Thank you for having me.
We are going to be talking about the Lyonnais shipwreck, which is the subject of your forthcoming book. This is going to be quite an interesting discussion. To begin with, I'd like to sort of find out, how did you start working in the underwater realm and becoming a shipwreck hunter before we head into the other delicious info?
So, like so many great stories, I think it starts with a love story. I met my partner, Joe Mazraani, in 2000 and actually 2013, and we became friends. And eventually, when we got involved together, I got introduced to his passion, which was shipwreck hunting and shipwreck diving. And I had never even been on a boat. And it wasn't the diving and the boat that necessarily hooked me. It was the stories of these shipwrecks. And I remember one time going to a presentation that he and his crew of divers had done, where they put up slides and talked about the length and width of U-boats. And it was like the most boring presentation I had ever seen. And I said, I want to know about the people who are on that U-boat. I want to know what they were thinking and feeling and experiencing. And through that, I started actually doing the research for the team, doing presentations for the team to try to bring these stories to life for people who were not like me, for people who didn't know about shipwrecks but were interested in the human side of this. And then I slowly got sucked into every aspect of running a dive boat and searching for shipwrecks.
Was this before or after you became an attorney?
This was well after I became an attorney. Both Joe and I are attorneys by day, and we like to say, shipwreck hunters or pirates on the weekends. But we actually met in court. That's how we met. But we're both attorneys by day.
Yeah, very interesting. So your focus is mostly in the North Atlantic region. So maybe I can just step back for a moment and ask you about the company.
So we own and operator. Joe owns and operates Atlantic Wreck Salvage, which is a small company. But really what we do is we're a group of people who share a passion and a love for finding shipwrecks and salvaging artifacts from them and sharing that with the members of our community. So it's very small. Like I said, we're both, full-time lawyers, and this is more of an aggressive hobby than it is anything else.
So how did you become a U.S. Coast Guard captain?
After I started getting more interested in what was going on in the boat and more interested in looking for shipwrecks, and particularly in looking for Lyonnais, which quickly became my obsession, I started doing everything that I could to be more productive and more helpful for the team, including going and getting my captain's license so I could help Joe operate the boat. So my desire to go and to do that and get my captain's license really just came from a desire to help find this and some of the other shipwrecks and be able to contribute more when we're out at sea.
So maybe you can talk about a couple of shipwreck projects that you've been on ahead of this one that we're going to talk about, and tell us what those experiences were like for you.
We have done a number of projects, and we continue to do a number of projects, some on shipwrecks that are well known and that we haven't found. For example, the Andrea Doria, we do a lot of work almost every year, are going to the Andrea Doria and documenting diving her. At two lesser known shipwrecks, one of my favorite projects that we worked on was the U-53 wreck. The German U-boat U-53 sank 5 ships off the coast of Nantucket at the very beginning of World War I, before America was even in World War I. And it's a fascinating story of how that happened. And we were part of a team who was looking for those wrecks. One of the divers and shipwreck hunters who we work with very often is a man named Captain Eric Takakjian from Massachusetts. He actually first learned about Lyonnais when doing research on the U-53 wrecks. And he found 4 out of the 5 of those wrecks in the late 1990s, and there was one missing. So a couple of years ago, we set out to find the final U-53 casualty called West Point, which we did in 2020, I believe it was 2020 or 2021. We were able to kind of put the piece of the puzzle to bed, which was really nice for us, not just to find this shipwreck that meant a lot to us personally, but also to be able to carry on Eric's work. Eric's been doing this a lot longer than us and has taught us a lot of what he knows, and it was really nice. It was almost like the students completing the work of the master when we were able to find that 5th wreck.
Very, very interesting. So this is around the time that you first heard of Lyonnais. Where did that take you? What path did you go down to get to the point where you've been so involved with this wreck?
I remember it was sometime in 2015, very, very early on, when I was just started getting involved in some of this stuff, saying to Joe, hey, like, I want to help find a shipwreck, thinking it was easy, right? Like, because I didn't know. Hey, I want to find a shipwreck. And I said, give me the name of one that you guys haven't found yet. And he said, Lyonnais, like almost as an afterthought. And I went home that weekend and did a ton of research. And when I showed it to Joe, he said, this weekend you found research that we hadn't even seen when we were looking for this. Keep going, send this to Eric. So Eric Takakjian and I kind of started to develop this email chain back and forth where we would share exchange information about the ship. All of me thinking it was really easy to find a shipwreck, not knowing how hard it was. And that was the beginning. So Eric had first heard about it when he was researching the U-53 wrecks. He and his small team looked for it in the late 1990s off the coast of Nantucket. Joe was actually part of some of those early expeditions kind of and search missions for it. And then they didn't find it, and they kind of just put it on the shelf. Because sometimes a wreck will catch fire and spark the interest of the team, and other times there's just other things to do. And this one fell in the category of we'll shelve it. There's other things to do. And I until like I picked it back up and then started researching and slowly became just obsessed with this particular wreck and bothering everybody about finding it until everybody else got on board. So that's kind of how this started. And it took almost 10 years of research, retooling, refining, and even completely refitting our boat to be able to go to where we needed to go and do what we needed to do to get to this particular wreck.
Right. So maybe you can give us a little background of how the ship came to wreck and the events that sort of happened in the aftermath.
It was 1856. So Lyonnais was a French passenger steamship from the Franco-American line, which was being set up to be one of the first transatlantic French shipping lines. The 1850s was really a time of things transitioning from sail to steam, of competition to carry passengers across the Atlantic. So a really exciting time in steamship history. And the Lyonnais was French companies, one of 6 sisters that a French company, Franco-American, was going to be using to carry passengers to and from New York and Le Havre, France. And on November 1st, 1856, the Lyonnais set out for Le Havre and never arrived because on the evening of the 2nd, she collided with the American sailing vessel Adriatic. Adriatic's captain was a man named Jonathan Durham. It's an accident. So there's always a lot of confusion when there's an accident. But ultimately, he said, I didn't see any reason to stick around. And he turned around and headed back to Massachusetts, towards Massachusetts, leaving the steamship in peril. She had 2 holes, a small one above the waterline and a bigger one below the waterline, and slowly sank over the course of a couple of days. So that was the collision. Then folks got into the lifeboats. Eventually, the captain abandoned ships. They got into the lifeboats. There weren't enough boats. They built a raft to hold sort of the overflow of crew. And I guess the short version of a very long and tragic story is that of the people on the ship, 114 died, only 18 survived. And those that did lived through extraordinary conditions in the North Atlantic, storms, dehydration, starvation, bitter freezing temperatures until they were eventually rescued by a passing ship. So yeah, that's the story of the sinking and the collision. But I always like to say with this book that the story of the survivors' rescue is really the beginning of the story and not the end, because after all of this, Captain Durham doesn't flee to France. He goes to France on a cargo run and gets seized in France and put on trial. So there's a whole second chapter of the book that deals with Durham's trial in France and what happens there.
Right. And so that it's sort of the plight of the survivors that you focus on there. So how many people were aboard altogether?
So it was 132, and the book is really, it's divided into two chapters. The first few sections. The first section is called Chapeau. There was a French sailor, Jean-Marie Louis Chapeau, who is credited by the survivors of being the one who managed to navigate the only lifeboat that made it to safety. And then the second half of the book is called Durham, and that deals with Durham's trial and eventual escape from France and a whole host of socio-political consequences that happen after this collision, and nations grappling with what happens when two ships from different countries meet at sea and there's an accident. Who's liable? How we figure that stuff out was all part of the aftermath of the sinking of this ship.
Right. So you, as being an attorney, probably have an interesting perspective than the layperson would, even though the laws, of course, are probably different now. Did you find that aspect kind of interesting?
That was really, really interesting, was seeing how after this, the reason the book is called The Adriatic Affair is because that's what they started calling it. The American press started calling it the Adriatic Affair, because it was causing a lot of conversation between the French government, the British government, the US government about how to grapple with collisions at sea and what rules we needed to put in place. So starting to see the beginning of this kind of rulemaking when it comes to number of lifeboats, essentially proposals for no-fault insurance, right? Like you're starting to see where this came from. And I think, quite honestly, the reason that people don't know about the Lyonnais and that nothing ever came of all of that conversation was the Civil War. Because you have the Civil War starting a few years after, and then everybody just drops everything because there's a Civil War. And quite frankly, the American government has better things to do at that point than figure this out. So it kind of gets parked for several years. But I often wonder what would have happened had the impending Civil War essentially like snuffed out all of this conversation.
Is there anything else that you'd like to highlight that about the work that you did with this and how it has emotionally impacted you?
It has been an emotional roller coaster, I'll tell you, because as I was writing the book, we started putting information into two categories, right? It was I had two piles. One was information that might help us find the ship, and the other was stuff that I just found really interesting. And I would go to Eric and Joe with stuff I found really interesting and be like, hey, guess what? So and so was traveling to France for this reason. And they would be like, very exciting. It's not going to help us find the ship. So the information about the characters, about people, some very famous people that were traveling aboard this ship, what the ship was carrying, all of that became the book. And then all of the other information became finding it. But there was a point in 2021 when we realized that the ship was much further than we originally anticipated it being. So we decided to completely overhaul our boat. We put in a new engine. We increased the fuel capacity. We changed the boat in significant ways just to be able to reach this ship. So obsession is a really funny thing, right? So you talk about two people who are just in it and then decide we want to do this thing, and we put our lives on hold to redo this, to go further when we had ever been before, and to be out there, 200 miles from our launching point in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean. In the epilogue of the book talks about us finding it. And I'll tell you, you'll see the ups and downs. We thought we didn't find it. And then the next day we went to a different spot and we realized we had found it. But when you get out there and you don't know whether you found it or not, I kind of realized out there during these search expeditions that the finding it almost doesn't matter. It's the fact that we're there and we're doing it. And we're in the middle of the North Atlantic, a place that it was much further and decades away from where we started, right? So it really makes you think that exploration is not always about the finding something, and I'm thrilled that we found it, but the real emotion of exploration is about being out there and looking for it. It's about the search, not necessarily even the joy of finding something.
But like you said, it took 10 years to sort of put this all together. So that's a lot of work. That's a lot of painstaking hours researching and everything else. So I imagine by the time you do get out there, it's like this big culmination of time that is caught up to that moment. And then when you did find the ship, you must have been somewhat elated by that point, or either just that or exhausted. Oh, yay.
Well, you know, we were thrilled. I mean, and also the discovery itself, it's nice when I guess it's nice. It's never happened to us when you can go down and see a name on it. Like I always think of those pictures of the Endurance when they found the Endurance, right? And you see Endurance, like, oh, that must be really nice. It took us 4 separate dives to be able to make the identification because we were picking up different pieces that were adding up, the clues adding up, and we wanted to be really careful about making sure we were right. The suspense too, just with every dive going, okay, we have another piece, we have another piece, we have a measurement, we found another thing consistent with the contract, right? You add these things, which is wonderful because at the end of it, there is this moment of joy and relief, and we do have some photos of the team celebrating, but it's also can make it a little anticlimactic because it's so slow. It's like 48 hours of making an identification instead of one sort of eureka moment.
So is there anything else you'd like to add about these experiences of working on this and also writing the book?
One thing that I do like to remind people about this is it wasn't that long ago that I was a person who had no idea about anything having to do with shipwrecks, diving, locating shipwrecks. I really tried to write the book with that in mind. I tried to make sure that things were explained so that if you were somebody who, like me, more than a decade ago, didn't know anything, could pick up this book and find something. So there is a huge focus on the characters, on what they went through, about 19th century life and experiences, and some education about what it was like to travel the oceans during that time. So it's my hope that there's something for everyone, whether you're a big shipwreck nerd like me now, or whether you're just someone who wants a really interesting story about human nature and human survival. It's all in there, including now, which is very exciting, this epilogue, because the book itself doesn't talk about the discovery. The book itself is very much historical nonfiction, but the epilogue talks about our personal experiences and how we found the shipwreck and everything that myself and the rest of this incredible team of people that I work with went through in that process and all those moments that we've talked about already.
Yeah, I am so looking forward to reading it because it's, the whole focus of this podcast is to help educate people about shipwrecks and not only shipwrecks themselves, but the people who are behind the work of finding shipwrecks, and that we've been learning so much already about how lay people, or as they call them, citizen scientists, can get involved in this field without having a degree as a maritime archaeologist or anything like that. There are still so many ways that you can get involved. So this has been really, really fascinating. So Jennifer, maybe you can say a little bit about your training program called All Aboard.
We have made a really strong commitment to sharing information about the ships we explore, artifacts that we recover, and information in general about technical diving and diving in the waters of the North Atlantic with the public, both because we think our maritime history is so important for people to understand as it connects to so many pivotal moments in our history, but also so that people can understand why artifact recovery and salvage is important. And also, diving, especially the deep kind of technical diving that we do, some of these wrecks that we've spoken about are in anywhere between 200 and 400 feet of water, the wrecks that we're diving. So it's deep. technical diving, that is sort of a dying sport. So we also have a very strong interest in encouraging people to explore the underwater world, not just in beautiful, warm, sunny places, but in places that are dark and cold, like the North Atlantic. So we started a program called All Aboard. And the purpose of the program is to bring maritime history to people through conferences, museum presentation, artifact displays. And a huge part of that program is education for students. So we'll offer presentations in classrooms. I've Zoomed into classrooms all over the country where we talk about specific shipwrecks and their connection to history. Some examples like, Titanic is always a big one with kids. They want to hear about Titanic. We did in 2019 an expedition to Britannic. So I've talked to a lot of classrooms and kids about what it was like to dive Britannic and talk about the history of the Olympic series of ships and how they connect to World War I. So things like that. We really do try to get these artifacts out to the public and the information out to the public so they can understand the very, very important history that's literally lying on the ocean floor, just miles from where they're sitting or where we're gathering.
So when you talk about the technical diving being a dying breed of people that go and do that, I mean, there's so many advances with underwater robotics and vehicles and all of that. So how do you see that sort of interplay? Because it's like the human diving is sort of still needed in some aspects. So I guess there's sort of a pairing that sometimes goes on between humans and technology, but hopefully, the technical diving won't be ruled out as obsolete before too long.
And we wouldn't have it because part of it for our divers is it's just enjoying that experience, right? I mean, there are people who just take to water like fish, and most of our divers are more at home underwater than they are on the surface. So for them, sure. I mean, we need robotic. We use side scan sonar to identify targets. There are all sorts of robotics that can do things that humans can't, can crawl into spaces we can't crawl into, can go deeper than humans ever could. But for us, being able to have that experience of being one-on-one and also to think, right, to be able to assess down there and think about what we want to do in that situation. There are advantages to having human beings down there exploring wrecks as opposed to machinery. But it's nice that we have all of these things available at our disposal around the world because we are certainly seeing more and more shipwreck discovery as the technology advances.
So do you want to say just a word or two about how you deal with artifact recovery?
Yes, so there is a lot of debate out there, and it's a debate that we certainly respect greatly about whether or not items should be salvaged from shipwrecks. Some people say leave them in situ, like leave them where they are. They shouldn't be removed. Other people have different feelings depending on the wreck. And certainly when you see places like the Great Lakes where shipwrecks are very, very well preserved, or even Britannic that I had mentioned earlier, that where that is, the ship itself is much better preserved than ships in the North Atlantic. Our feeling is that artifacts from North Atlantic shipwrecks need to be recovered. And part of the reason for that is that these wrecks are being torn apart. They are collapsing. The weather in this area is particularly violent and does a lot of damage. Shifting sands will bury wrecks. Fishing gear will plow into a wreck. The wreck that I mentioned earlier, the West Point, when we discovered it, we saw the two helms of the ship and we left them because we knew we were coming back. We wanted to photograph and document some things before we recovered them. When we went back 2 years later, 3 scallop dredges had plowed into the shipwreck and one had pulled one of the helms all the way across it and twisted it up. It was a mangled piece of metal that was no longer recognizable. So I think I appreciate that people have different perspectives. Some of these wrecks are also extremely far offshore where people just aren't going. Many of the wrecks that we were diving off the coast of Nantucket, we're the only people diving them. So we always say, do you want maybe 10 people to be able to see an item underwater, to be able to reach the depths get themselves out there, reach the depth, and dive the wreck, and also risk the chance that in a year it could be gone, ripped away by a fishing net or buried in the sand? Or do we want to take the best possible chance of members of the public being able to see it and interact with it? And we prefer the latter in this particular area of the world. I don't think that the same is the case for the Great Lakes or other places where wrecks are better preserved. And our experiences working with survivors has really told us that there's something about interacting with these artifacts that is irreplaceable. We in 2017 found the foghorn from the Adriatic. We brought it up, had it fully restored, worked with the original manufacturer, restored it, and then on the 65th anniversary of the Doria sinking, did an event with survivors where we blew the horn. And they would be the first ones to tell you about the emotion of that experience and being able to connect with something that happened to them 65 years ago. So, I say to people, there's a reason we go to museums. There's a reason we want to look at a case and stare at a plate that someone once used years ago. And the practical reality of the North Atlantic and some of these smaller, lesser known wrecks is that the only way that we're going to be able to do that is if citizens, if people like us are able to remove, recover, restore these artifacts and then show them to people. So that's at least our opinion on it, but it's something we get asked about a lot. And I thought maybe the viewers of this podcast would be particularly interested in.
Yes, that's a great perspective, and I really appreciate your time, Jennifer. It's been great.
Thank you so much for having me.
The wreckage lies, broken masts and shattered pride. In the deep the answers hide. Echoes of the past call out. Whispers from beneath the waves. What secrets do the shadows keep? Do we dare disturb their sleep?